Okay, so welcome everyone back to pathophysiology. This module we're going to cover more details about the cell membrane. We're going to go over organelles that are within the cell and discuss their different functions. And then following that, we're going to then cover a variety of different tissue types within the human body. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is your typical cell in the body. Okay, it has quite a few organelles in it. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is the cell membrane, which is surrounding the entire structure. Okay, we're going to get into much more detail about it and its functions. And then we're going to spend some time talking about some of these organelles, such as the mitochondria, the lysosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum. We can talk about the cytoplasm, Golgi apparatus or Golgi vesicles, the nucleus, of course, and ribosomes. Now, there's an assortment of different microtubules and microfilaments and centrosomes. We're not going to get into those, okay? We're going to concentrate on some specific organelles that are important to the function of the cell. So here's an image of the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, whichever one you want to call it. And the overall structure is a biphospholipid layer. And you can see those phosphate heads all collected on the outside of the cell membrane and on the inside facing inwards with their lipid tails facing away from any water, which is extracellular fluid or the cytoplasm. Okay, so it's a biphospholipid layer. Now, within the structure of this plasma membrane are many, many proteins. Some of them will be used for transporting different molecules, such as channel proteins. Cholesterol molecules actually are interspersed throughout the whole plasma membrane of every cell in your body. And what does cholesterol do? It stabilizes the plasma membrane. So we often hear of cholesterol as a potentially harmful molecule in your body. In actual fact, we need cholesterol to stabilize our plasma membrane. Okay, so we wouldn't actually survive without cholesterol. It's just that when we get into the different parts of cholesterol and discuss them from a point of the cardiovascular system is when we talk about the damaging effects of cholesterol. But when we're talking about the plasma membrane, it's extremely important. Okay. Now, you're also going to see little glycoproteins. So that's a protein with a carbohydrate group attached to it. There's going to be receptors on this plasma membrane that can accept a hormone, for example, that can communicate within the cell. So there's all kinds of different proteins and molecules floating around either within the plasma membrane or right through it. So as I've mentioned before, the cell membrane is a bilayer of phospholipids with the phosphate group always facing the water surfaces, which is the extracellular fluid and the cytoplasm, and the lipids, those long lipid tails facing inwards. And that makes up the general structure of the cell membrane. Okay, and of course within this cell membrane, there are so many proteins and glycoproteins and cholesterol molecules that are all responsible for communicating with other cells, receiving information onto receptors, and also channels that allow molecules to enter the cell. Okay, a perfect example would be insulin. That's going to allow glucose. So insulin is a hormone. It's going to go to many, many cells in the body when it gets secreted by the pancreas, and it's going to allow glucose to go into the cell, okay, for metabolism and energy production. Okay, so the cell membrane is semi-permeable. It easily allows diffusion of oxygen, for example, into the cell, which is required for aerobic metabolism, which takes place in the mitochondria, and it allows for waste to diffuse across, such as carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide is a waste product of aerobic metabolism. Okay, and we'll see some images where there's many molecules required to function within the plasma membrane, as carrier proteins, protein channels, receptors. It's a pretty amazing system that every cell in your body has this plasma membrane with all these communicating proteins and channels. So when you see the term glycoprotein or glycolipid, that's just a fancy way of saying a protein with a sugar molecule attached to it, or a fat, a lipid, with a sugar molecule attached to it, right? And these are throughout the plasma membrane to run a whole bunch of different processes, whether they're receptors or they're channels. They'll all have different functions. Okay, so let's go over some of these functions. So one of them will be to adhere to other cells. So you're going to have proteins in the cell membrane that will allow it to hold on to other cells. Sorry. So for example, with tight junctions, or what are called adherens junctions, so that cells in a particular area can form a structure and hold on to each other. Okay. Proteins are also responsible for cell-to-cell recognition, meaning the body's immune system can look at its own cells and say, I recognize this to be myself. And that's very important because the immune system also has to recognize when something foreign has entered into the body, such as an infection, whether it's a virus or a bacteria. The immune system needs to recognize it as foreign. Okay, so every cell in the body has proteins on it that are involved in self-recognition. Okay, there's also protein channels and transport molecules that allow molecules to go through the cell membrane, right? So you can see that the cell membrane is a very busy place, allowing waste to leave and allowing a lot of molecules to go into the cell. Okay? And crossing the cell membrane really depends on what molecule wants to get across, and also if it's a charged molecule. So for example, oxygen, that's a pretty small molecule. It can just diffuse right across the cell membrane. Okay? So oxygen and CO2, not charged, easily diffuses back and forth. Larger molecules or charged molecules, such as sugar, glucose, amino acids, or charged electrolytes, such as sodium, potassium, and chloride, they need channels or carriers. The cell membrane doesn't just want these to go in on their own will. they want to control the influx of electrolytes and amino acids and glucose. Okay. Every cell has what's called a membrane potential, meaning there's typically a charge across the cell between the extracellular area and the intracellular compartment. And that's the reason why sodium is typically much more elevated at a higher level in the extracellular fluid than the intracellular fluid, the cytoplasm. Potassium tends to be more concentrated within the cells and less concentrated in the extracellular area or compartment. And that allows for cells to have an electro potential across the membrane. Okay, and I'm sure you've learned in the past that that allows for conduction and action potentials, right? That charge across the membrane. Okay, so cells maintain an electro potential across them. Okay, so let's look at some cell membrane proteins. So you can see that amazing biphospholipid layer. It almost looks like just an ocean of phosphate heads, and within it is interspersed with proteins that either cross the entire membrane, which would be called transmembrane proteins, and they're typically transport channels or carriers of ions and molecules to go into the cell or out of the cell. Cholesterol, as I've mentioned before, is a stabilizing molecule in the cell membrane. It keeps the cell membrane together, okay, as opposed to falling apart. Okay, so it's very stabilizing. And then you also have peripheral proteins that don't span the entire depth of the cell membrane. They don't span from one side to the other. And they can be involved for communication with other cells through, say, signals such as hormones that come in the bloodstream. They can be involved in signaling to cells that are adjacent to them. So you have peripheral proteins, whether they're on the inside or the outside of the cell membrane, and then you have transmembrane proteins that are typically transport channels and carriers of ions in and out of the cell. Okay, so it seems like I like to chat about information on the slide before. I hope that's a good thing, because then when you're looking at this slide, you've already heard about peripheral versus transmembrane proteins. So transmembrane protein, it goes right across the cell membrane and typically is involved in transfer of ions from, say, the extracellular compartment to the intracellular compartment, or the other way around. Okay, so ions will go back and forth, or transport channels for other molecules such as glucose to get into the cell. Okay, now some of these membranes or some of these proteins, sorry, will need active transport. And when you see the word active transport, that means that it needs to use ATP, which is the body's energy currency, right? So adenosine triphosphate. So some of them have active transport, some of the channels will just have passive diffusion through the membrane protein. So it just depends on what we're talking about. If we're referring to the sodium-potassium pump, say, where we'll come to this on another slide, where sodium is actively pumped out of the cell. Remember, the cell has less sodium in it, and potassium is pumped into the cell, so it trades a sodium for a potassium. That takes energy, right? That uses ATP to maintain that gradient, okay? Because you're actively pumping potassium into a higher concentration of potassium, and you're pumping sodium out of the cell into a higher concentration of sodium in the extracellular compartment. So requires ATP. Okay, peripheral proteins. They lie on one side of the membrane, whether it's the inner part of the membrane or the outer part of the membrane, which is extracellular. And they are involved in all kinds of functions for receptors, cell identification, so that they don't get destroyed by their own body, right? So, and also signaling to cells beside them. So all kinds of surface functions in terms of receptor function and self-recognition of the cell. Okay, and here's just some functions of these cell membrane proteins. So the first one, the intercellular joining, that's just to keep the cells together, right? So inter always means between at least two. Intra means the cell itself. So intracellular is referring to the inside of one cell. Inter is between at least two cells. So the joining that we spoke about before between cells, proteins function to in that role. You can also have proteins in the cell membrane that have an enzyme role, meaning a molecule can attach to a protein that's functioning as an enzyme, and the molecule will be converted or broken down to different molecules. Active transportation. So transmembrane proteins can allow molecules just to go right across, and that would be passive transport. No energy required. It'll just diffuse across from higher gradient to lower gradient. Active transport requires energy, and it's typically because the protein is acting as a pump to transport molecules against gradients, right? So it needs energy to do that, which is ATP. Cellular recognition. So the immune system is constantly surveilling the body, looking for any antigens, or foreign antigens, I should say. So a foreign antigen is basically the same as saying a foreign molecule or a foreign substance. And your cells shouldn't be foreign to itself. So they should not be attacked typically. When we talk about autoimmune diseases, that's where the body recognizes certain parts of it as foreign and attacks them. And you're going to hear a lot about autoimmune diseases. And that is exactly what happens, is that the immune system recognizes particular parts of the body as foreign and attacks and tries to destroy them. Okay, so proteins are involved in cellular recognition. Anchoring and attachment. So proteins can anchor, say, glycoproteins or lipids. They can anchor other molecules to them on the inside or the outside. And of course, signaling. So a protein can accept, say, a signal that was in the bloodstream, and it can then transduct the signal, meaning once the molecule has attached onto the protein, it'll send a signal within the cell to behave in a certain way or to start producing something that's required of the body. So it just depends on what the signal is. Okay.